Thanks, Fred, and good morning, everyone. It's a wonderful privilege to be preaching to you from here at the Prayer House in Forest Hill, and I'm delighted to be able to talk about this second half of Acts 14, where we see Paul and Barnabas wrapping up the end of that first missionary journey, and they're traveling from city to city. We see the pace really picks up, as it were, and we see a snapshot of them going from place to place, establishing elders, strengthening the church, and then heading back to Syrian Antioch to report back on everything that God has done in this missionary journey. It seems a while ago now, but it was back in Acts 13, wasn't it, that we read together about how the Holy Spirit prompted the church while they were fasting and praying, prompted them to set aside Paul and Barnabas for missionary work and to go and be a light to the Gentiles. So that was roughly now 2 years ago. The whole missionary journey was approximately 2 years, and it's coming to an end in today's passage. And we're going to take a little bit of time to summarize and look at what God has done in these 2 years and to be encouraged and inspired. As I was reading this and preparing, it reminded me of how much I used to love these sections about the missionary journeys. And when I was a young adult and had recently been baptized, I used to love it. I used to read them and feel so challenged and inspired and yearn in my heart, long to be part of God's church and part of this church, which is growing and overcoming difficulties. So to go back to last week where Henry began the story and to pick up in verse 19, we know that Paul and Barnabas had recently healed this man at Lystra, and it was reminiscent of the way that Peter, if you remember, healed the man at the beautiful gate in Acts 3. And that also was reminiscent of how Jesus used to heal and healed many, many people in this miraculous way and told them, get up and walk. So Paul has just been doing that with this man in Lystra, verse 8. And then as a result of this miraculous healing, there's this huge kind of desire from the local people, from the Gentiles, to worship them and to call them Hermes and Zeus and to bring out calves and make sacrifices to them on the edge of the city and to have garlands and all sorts of rituals. And Paul and Barnabas are very quick to say no, and they rip their clothes, if you remember. And they say, no, we serve a living God who is so different to Hermes and who is so different to Zeus. And they rip their clothes almost in protest and sheer devastation that they could be likened to those gods. And they say, no, we serve a living God. And then even so, verse 18, it says, even saying these things with difficulty, they restrained the crowds from offering sacrifices to them. But then verse 19, where we pick up today, how quickly it turns, because the Jews come from Antioch and Iconium and they begin to win over the crowds. So, 1 minute the crowds are worshipping them, wanting to offer sacrifices. And then the next minute they're wanting to kill and to stone them. And of course, the difference that comes in there, verse 19, is these Jews, the Jews that traveled up. And it says some of them have come from Pisidian Antioch, which is about 90 miles. Okay, so they have been really committed to persecuting Paul, so much so that they would actually travel 90 miles. Before the days of the car, this took a long while. And they would do it either on foot or on donkey or by chariot. And they had traveled 90 miles to find Paul and to continue trying to threaten him and persecute him. And those who were coming from Iconium, again, it's around 30 miles. So this was no small commitment that these Jews pursued and followed Paul and then turned the crowds against him. And I was thinking, have you ever had that feeling when you flee from something or you move away, you run away from something, but it follows you anyway? I remember talking to a friend who moved out of London because she was so sick of the humdrum life, how busy, how pressured it was. She moved away, and the first 6 months she was delighted that, oh wow, our life is so much better and it's so peaceful. But then I remember talking to her about a year in, and she said, it's funny how actually you think you've left all your problems behind, but so many of them actually come with you and they follow you where you go. So this, in a sense, is what's happening to Paul here. They fled the persecution, but the persecution has followed them. And it's probably very hurtful for Paul that, in a sense, it's the Jews, it's his own people, It's the ones where he grew up, obviously, as a very devout Jew, and he really stuck to this teaching. He was zealous, wasn't he? And actually, it's those people that are wanting to kill him. And often I've had that experience in my own life and in leading churches, that sometimes it's actually the people who are around, who you think will be the most receptive, who are the ones that then cause destruction in the church. And that is very hard, isn't it? I remember about a year in to our time church planting in Thailand, we'd had a really, really good we'd had a really good first year, and we were feeling really encouraged, and we were beginning to see a church um, growing and rising up. But then several things happened, including the king of Thailand dying. And there was like a wave of opposition that came, and a lot of it came from the Christians, the other Christians around that were watching us or commenting about the church or saying, you don't understand, you're foreigners, you're from another place. And it's almost harder to hear that kind of thing when people turn against you who are Christians or who are from, your people, like these Jews would have been for Paul. So he's got these Jews against him following around. He's probably well used to it by now, I have to say. But then there's the double-edged sword of, you've also got the Gentiles who they've recently upset by saying, no, don't offer your sacrifices of your gods to us. We don't want to be associated with your gods. We're rejecting, in a sense, your gods. So that would have also made them angry. And so they're coming and they stone Paul. The fact that they stone him in the city probably means it was like a spontaneous reaction rather than a sort of planned thing. Because in those days, where it was a planned kind of punishment for heresy or something, that would happen outside the city. But here they clearly stoned him almost in like an impulse in the city, and then drag him out and assume he's dead. Then in verse 20, we see the disciples have come and stood around Paul. And I think it's a really beautiful picture of church, that actually as the disciples are stood around him, that he gets the strength to stand up. Some people have speculated that he actually raised from the dead, but I think given that Luke says that actually he uses the phrase supposing him to be dead in verse 19, that in a sense we have no reason to assume that he was dead, but it's more that he was probably in so much pain and couldn't get up after his stoning. But actually, when it's the disciples that stand around him, almost like encircle him, that he gets the strength to stand. And so as a church, we need to do that for one another, don't we? That when one of us is down or feeling absolutely like we can't carry on or close to death, that the others of us stand around and say, come on, rise up and overcome. So it does. When the disciples stood around him, he got up and then he goes back into the city. And then the next day, straight away, no time to recover. The next day, he goes off to Derby with Barnabas. And you can imagine he would have been cuts, bruises and all, everything. And he heads there with his visible signs of the persecution, and he carries on preaching. So after they'd preached in Derby and they'd seen many disciples, verse 21, that's amazing, isn't it? The day after he'd been stoned and nearly killed, then the next day he travels to Derby and they see many, many disciples. Imagine if Paul hadn't got up. Imagine if he had just packed it in at that point. They wouldn't have seen those disciples, would they? So then after that, they see many disciples, and then they return to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. And they strengthen the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying to them, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. So I think I've got a map. We could bring up the map. And it's really just to show a visual of the cities and of their traveling around, but also really to demonstrate how easy it would have been for them to carry on eastward over land and go back to Syrian Antioch that way, wouldn't it? It would have been very easy for them to do that. However, they decide to go in the complete opposite direction and go back through the cities where they've already been to strengthen the believers there. And that is absolutely incredible, isn't it? They go back into the cities where they've already had lots of hostility. They've had all these different challenges and reactions, but they go there to strengthen the Christians. And they go there, they encourage them, and they move round. and then they head back to Syrian Antioch that way. So how do they encourage them? Well, it's quite incredible. They encourage them by saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. Doesn't sound hugely encouraging, does it? But actually, in the climate they were in, that's exactly what they needed to know, which is that you are going to have to be strong. You are going to have to face challenges. When we were in Thailand, I remember that when we would talk to people, if people were interested in becoming Christians or they were open, we would have to say to them that, this will mean a change in your lifestyle. You won't be going to the Buddhist temples. The whole of the way that the society is run is orientated around the Buddhist temples. Even people's weddings, funerals, any kind of event, it all orientates around the temple and worship at the temple. So we would have to say to them that actually they would face, in a sense, social exclusion, that this whole part of their life would have to die, in a sense, would have to end. And often they would get from their families loads of pressure or, negativity about becoming Christians. And so we would have to lay it out to them. And it was, in a sense, really hard for them to hear. But it was important to tell them at the beginning so they knew the choice that they were making. And that is nothing in comparison to what these guys were facing. Even all that social pressure and difficulty was nothing like the physical danger that these disciples were coming under when they were becoming Christians. But Paul, he just tells them straight, and he says, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom. And how can he do that? How can that be an encouragement? Well, it's obvious, but it's because Jesus himself went through much tribulation in order to bring in a new kingdom for us. And that's the kingdom that Paul is part of. That's the kingdom that these new disciples are part of. So while he's saying that to them, while he's saying to them that, through many tribulations you must come into the kingdom, Paul well knows what those tribulations are. He himself has experienced it, but he also knows that Jesus, our Saviour, experienced it and overcame it in order to bring in a whole new kingdom and a new way of life. So it says he was strengthening the souls of the disciples, verse 22. I like that, strengthening the souls. Maybe we need to be strengthened. Sometimes we might be a little bit wishy-washy or a little bit weak. And actually we do need to grow a resilience, don't we? Especially in the West, where we don't necessarily face kind of physical persecution. We need to take from this about the strength of the disciples. We need to be strong. We need to be strengthened to our souls, right into our hearts and souls and minds. So Paul was strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith and saying, through many tribulations we must enter the kingdom of God. And then after that, he appoints elders, he appoints leaders in each place. And then, I love it, having prayed with fasting, verse 23. Having prayed with fasting, they commend them to God. And this is a lovely kind of cycle right back to Acts 13, where it was in the midst of prayer and fasting when Paul and Barnabas themselves were sent out. And then we see here that as they're planting these churches, they're raising up leaders, they're putting in structures, they're putting right at the heart of the structure, right at the moment of appointing the leaders, they are doing it with prayer and with fasting. And so they are kind of continuing, just as they were sent out, they're continuing that in each church, the importance of prayer, the importance of fasting, and that then they commend them to God in whom they believe. And they say, we are commending and releasing these leaders to serve you. We've been fasting this week, haven't we, on Thursday? And it's always very challenging fasting, isn't it? But I love the fact that we fast in Ichthus once a month all together. I'm sure we do other fasting privately, but that Roger and Faith have asked us to fast the first Thursday of every month. And it's a powerful symbol of our unity, but also to say, God, we are depending on you. We want to hear from you in our leadership, in our churches, in the way that we search after you, God, in the decisions we are making, that we are fasting together. So verse 23, that they prayed with fasting and they commended these leaders to God. And then they start their journey back. They, of course, carry on, verse 25, speaking the word in Perga, down to Italia, and then across to Syrian Antioch by boat from where they came. So they're going right back to where they came. And then they then report back, verse 27, everything that has happened and how God has opened a door to the Gentiles, and they spend a long time with them, verse 28. So what can we kind of learn from this? We can learn back, can't we, that the importance of reporting, the importance of sharing testimony, of when we see breakthrough in people's lives, that we have to be accountable. We are accountable to the people that we work with. Just like Paul and Barnabas, I go back to Syrian Antioch, they are accountable for what's happened. They tell them, they report back. That's important, isn't it? That we do that we keep testifying, that we keep sharing what God has been doing. And it's, as I think about this, as I think about the missionary journeys, this first missionary journey, I'll bring up just a quick summary slide just to remind you what it was like. As I've already said, it began in Acts 13 when they were fasting and praying, and God said, set aside Paul and Barnabas. Then they went to Seleucia, if you remember, from there to Cyprus, and then they go through the whole island. Do you remember they meet Bar Jesus and Elymas the magician? Paul rebukes him and says he's full of deceit, and then he becomes blind, which is obviously the reverse of what's happened with Paul. And from there, they go to Perga, then they travel up and around Pisidian Antioch, where lots happens. Paul gives that long preach in the synagogue. It's well received. People are begging them to continue. But then in this passage we're looking at today, the Jews become jealous and start stirring people up. And so they go around these cities and strengthen them, Lystra, Derbe, and then they head back. In total, something like over 1,200 miles that they travelled on this journey with no planes. You know, I mean, doing missionary stuff for us now, going visiting, is much easier, isn't it? But this was hard, long journeys with no planes. It took them, as I said, around 2 years, but they saw such incredible fruit. They saw things planted. And what I love is that Paul just preaches out of real conviction, but also such compassion. He probably remembers, doesn't he, that every time he's being stoned, like in this story when he's being stoned, that he himself was part, or he was at least a bystander for Stephen's stoning, that he was there, he watched it, he was in a full agreement with it, wasn't it? And so he, even when he's being stoned, I bet in his mind he was thinking, but you know, maybe the next me is standing here watching. Maybe even when it was at Lystra, maybe even Timothy was in the crowd. We don't know, do we? We know Timothy came from Lystra. Maybe Timothy watched that. Maybe he watched Paul being stoned. And so all through it, there's this amazing compassion and conviction. Those are the two words, compassion and conviction, that Paul speaks with. And so as we think about our lives and what we can learn from these missionary journeys, I want you to think compassion and conviction. So what can we learn from the first missionary journey? Sometimes God calls us to go. Sometimes he calls us to be, like with Paul and Barnabas, to step out. Right from Abraham, wasn't it? God said, go. And sometimes some of us do have to go. We go somewhere to serve God, either abroad or maybe into a different part of the country, or we're going out into a mission field, even in our own area. And God sometimes is calling some of us to go and to be in action. We must go when we go through fasting and praying. We must do that. We must fast. We must pray. And the importance here is of the fasting and praying church back in Antioch that had sent them. But also, remember, there's a church back in Jerusalem that was the first ones there, to the first earliest church as well, who are also holding the ground. And next chapter, they're going to go back to Jerusalem, aren't they? And report back and then discuss how the Gentiles are going to be integrated into the church. So there's lots of different roles here in these missionary journeys. There is Paul and Barnabas, who overcame in such an incredible and inspiring way. But there's also the praying and fasting church at Antioch, and there's the praying and fasting church back in Jerusalem, who are holding the ground. So we all have a role to play. And here in Ichthus, we really believe in mission, don't we? And we do have people that are serving long-term overseas, and we commit to pray for them. We pray regularly, don't we? We are like that praying, sending church there praying. And we must keep our faith up for healings, isn't it? And for church planting, for seeing how it's so miraculous, the number of churches that were planted in this time. And of course, the Lystra and Derbe, they're actually in the region of Galatia. And another thing that Paul did, as well as all this travelling, was he actually wrote the first epistle to the Galatians, which we call the book of Galatians, during this time. Because that's the other thing about Paul, is he went round visiting and strengthening, but he also then continued to write letters and epistles to strengthen them. So it's really, really inspiring, isn't it, to see this level of commitment to the gospel, this level of conviction, this level of compassion. But I also want to encourage us that even if you're not the one that's out going into the mission field, that you have a role to play in praying and in fasting and in releasing others to do that. So I'll hand back to Joel in a minute for a response, but whatever your role is, whether you are a missionary out there, whether that's in your heart to do, whether you're the one out trying to pray for healing and reach out, see churches planted, or whether you're the one back in the church that's holding the ground, praying and fasting, we must be strengthened. We must be strengthened, and we must be willing to enter the kingdom of God through many tribulations. And I don't think it was just Paul and Barnabas that were facing the tribulations. I'm absolutely sure that back in the churches in Antioch and Jerusalem, they faced many tribulations in order to keep going, the pressures that would come on the church. And remember that it was the persecution that happened around Stephen and the church there, isn't it, around Acts 7. It was that persecution, which is why lots of the disciples fled and the gospel began to get spread. So there was plenty of persecution happening in Jerusalem itself as well. So wherever our role is, whether we're sort of in the mission field or in the sending churches, that we must be strengthened and we must be ready to face tribulation. I'm going to pray and then hand back to Joel. Well, Lord, I thank you so much for the incredible inspiration of this missionary journey that comes to an end in this passage. And Lord, I just want to pray, Father, for any of us, Lord, who even are feeling a stirring now in our hearts that we need to go. We need to go. Whether that's to a nation or whether that's just in our communities. Lord, I pray you just to kindle that afresh in our hearts. Give us courage. Give us faith, Lord, for healing and for church planting into areas where there are no churches. And Lord, for those of us that are part of the praying and fasting church, Lord, strengthen us as well. Strengthen us. Strengthen us to be able to endure tribulation and pressure that comes on the churches. Lord, strengthen us and be with us, I pray. Amen. Back to you, Joel.